Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Jenna Gatsky. I run Carroll's Prairie Springs Environmental Education Center. So I think this is our 5th talk this academic year. So I'm pretty excited to have Joe Piatt talking with us today about the current water situation in Waukesha.
Okay, yeah, so if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt as we go along. So I'll finish introducing myself. So yeah, been here since fall 98. I'm a Wisconsin boy. I did my undergrad at Marquette University. I did my master's in environmental engineering sciences at Minnesota, and then went to the University of Arizona for my PhD and a postdoc in soil, water, and environmental science. So I kind of moved from science to engineering and then back into the sciences. I've got a split appointment here at Carroll in chemistry and environmental science. It's been, Carroll's been a nice home for me. And so I think we'll just keep moving on here then. So yeah, if there's any other questions about who I am or what I do, so the title of the talk about bridging the divide, there seems to be many divides these days. I'll only talk about this one that deals with water, but I'm referring to the subcontinental divide. And so we're here in Waukesha County, and there is a topographic divide that separates the Lake Michigan watershed from the Fox River watershed. And so that will become important as we roll through the talk here. So in terms of the story, Waukesha's water story dates back, as long as the history of the city. It used to be famous for its water, all the springs, these freshwater carbonate type springs. They were believed to have healing powers, and so Waukesha is the spring city. As time went on and population increased, more water usage, I should say more groundwater usage, what became an issue for the city is high radium and dissolved salts. And as there was more pumping, the water table levels declined, especially because we are taking water from the deep aquifer, which is a confined aquifer. And so the city's been under EPA, or actually it's Department of Justice requirement to become compliant with EPA regulations for quite a while. Those have been extended, and the current extension brings us to about September 2022 to be fully compliant at each well. So the solution to that, from the Waukesha's perspective, was, in terms of getting a new source, was to look to the Great Lakes. The problem with that is we're on the wrong side of the divide, and we'll tell a bit about that story. And so, but as the city of Waukesha looked for a new water supply, the main goals were a sustainable supply, both from a quantity and quality perspective, as well as environmental sustainability, public health, and then cost. And so if you look at our current system here, if you look at the off on the right side here, the sort of the dark gray area is the city limits of the city of Waukesha. The little white areas here, they're what they call town islands. These are where the city has enveloped town areas that still have not become part of the city. And then you got the townships that kind of surround the city. But we have 7 deep sandstone wells. Those are drilled down roughly 1,600 to 2,000 feet deep, although the pump heads maybe sit down around 900 to 1,200 feet depending. 3 of those are active wells, 4 on standby depending on the needs for the city. There are 3 shallow wells. Those are surface aquifer wells. Those are much closer to the surface, about 105 to 150 feet deep. Those are in that shallow sand and gravel. And those more or less are kind of down by, if you remember where Waukesha West High School is, these are some of these shallow groundwater wells here. The system has some storage tanks, pump stations. We have almost 340 miles of pipe in ground to get water to the customers. And so currently there's roughly, the population of Waukesha is still in sort of the low 70s, 73, maybe 74,000. We have about 24,000 distinct customers. Okay, and then, but again, the job of the water utilities provide clean, potable water in sufficient quantities. And so Waukesha really is, again, has both that water quantity and water quality issue. Waukesha is not unique for inland counties here in southeastern Wisconsin, where most of our water, if we look here in sort of this upper right, is provided by groundwater. And so although this is kind of where the story starts back in the 90s even, is that we rely solely on groundwater for our supply. The counties that go along Lake Michigan, like Milwaukee County right here, is primarily at this point surface water, or Lake Michigan, although they used to be completely groundwater driven. But again, Washington County, Walworth County, even Ozaukee County, although it's along the lake, still relies heavily on groundwater. So again, we have a quantity issue because our groundwater is stressed, but that's what we rely on. And again, you can see this visually here, that if you look at Waukesha's line here over the years, we are the major pumper here in southeastern Wisconsin by far. And so along with those heavier pumping rates also came deep declines in the deep aquifers. And so whether you're in Kenosha, Racine, Waukesha, Milwaukee County, significant declines on the orders of hundreds of feet in that deep groundwater water, the deep aquifer water table. Okay. And so the reason for that, the main hydrogeologic regions, Waukesha is said to have a shale problem. This Maquoketa aquitard is what's called a confining layer. It's a layer through which it prevents the recharge of this deep aquifer. And so above this red layer here, you have the surface aquifers that go down, a few hundred feet. Then you have the shale layer that prevents further infiltration of water to recharge the deep aquifer. And so the recharge zone for this deep aquifer under the red here is way out kind of in Oconomowoc, right? So here, water has the ability, this is the recharge zone, water has the ability to first infiltrate and percolate vertically, and then ultimately that groundwater, the regional groundwater flow essentially moves west to east towards Lake Michigan, okay? But that's our problem here. So Waukesha would sit somewhere about in here where I'm moving the cursor. And again, that's where that aquitard layer is. And that's why we've seen such steep declines in the water table levels. And again, this is more of a cross-sectional view, a cartoon, just to show how deep those wells go if you compare it to the skyline in Milwaukee. So again, here's that Maquoketa aquitard, or that shale layer that prevents recharge. Okay. And again, why does that occur? So as we pumped hard over the years, right? So this first cartoon up here, this is from a USGS circular. This would be pretty typical pre-development flow for Waukesha here. So if you think of this, it's labeled stream, but imagine that being Lake Michigan, and you essentially have groundwater flow moving west to east towards the lake. Actually, because of hydrogeology, most of that water actually moves underneath the lake and goes towards Michigan. So there's kind of a weak hydrologic connection between Lake Michigan itself and the underlying aquifer, but it's a little bit maybe too in-depth. Again, as you begin to pump, though, you create a cone of depression, circled here in yellow, okay? And the other thing you start to do, okay, is you start to change the flow lines. So as you can see here, there's still some flow that was going towards the stream or the lake. But what you do when you pump a well is you basically reverse flow lines, because now that water is moving towards the well. And as you pump even harder, this third one, that cone increases more. You start to drop the water table more. And here you can see there's been, at least in this cartoon, a total reversal of the flow lines. Okay. On the right side here is actually a diagram of the cones of depression in the Chicago-Milwaukee area. So these comprise the largest cone of depression in the world. And it's because there's just such heavy pumping in both of those metropolitan areas. Okay. And so that's sort of the quantity concern here. Again, the cone of depression used to be over Milwaukee. Once they switched from groundwater to surface water in 1950, that major cone of depression is shifted out into Waukesha County, where again the city of Waukesha is the heaviest pumper. Okay, this is just another cartoon from the modelers. that show the trapping of those groundwater flow lines, again, that get captured because of the pumping of our wells. And again, so what we've done then is we moved that deep groundwater divide. We continue to move that further west. The shallow aquifer divide is actually east of Waukesha. All right. Again, this is just another diagram here to show, again, this red dot here, the central pumping has moved to Waukesha. And again, we continue to push that groundwater divide, which becomes important because part of what Waukesha had to demonstrate was that if we wanted to request a Lake Michigan diversion, it was important to show that we actually impacted that Lake Michigan watershed, which would include the ground watershed. And so part of what Waukesha could demonstrate is that we were part of the ground watershed for Lake Michigan. All right. So again, just another reminder that, but also really the major driver for this, well, I guess they were equivalent, the quantity issues as well as quality. As we go after that deep aquifer water, it's old, a lot of stuff is dissolved in it, so salinity is increasing. We have lots of hardness in the water here because these aquifers are dolomite, calcium, magnesium carbonates. There's naturally occurring arsenic, barium, and strontium in the water, which can be an issue. But the big one that drove this story that you probably, even when you were all students, you probably heard about was radium. Radioactive compound. The EPA limit is about 5 picocuries per liter. Waukesha can be as high as 15. So really, that's the court order was to meet that radium limit. Again, Waukesha currently meets all guidelines, but it had to put treatment plants on those deep wells, and then we do some blending of the water. So we kind of dilute the radiation to meet the regulations. So we take that surface aquifer water and then dilute it with deep aquifer water to meet the limit for some of to meet some of the requirements. All right. And so what this big then was how do you manage water resources? Okay, so imagine your Waukesha, and really starting around the 80s for sure, this issue became really highlighted. And so there's lots of talk about water resource management. And again, groundwater and surface water are connected, integrated resource. So you can't separate them. And again, you have to manage both the quantity and the quality. We've talked about those already. So, quantity, reservoirs, aquifers, diversions. Quality would be whether it's inorganic, organic, biological, radiation. And so the way it's managed in short is what's called a watershed management concept, where it's best or thought to be best that you manage water by its native watershed, which most people think of as just a topographic divide. That's really how a watershed is described. But when we think of groundwater, the groundwater divide and the surface water divides don't necessarily match up. And so what did that mean for Waukesha is that along this time, right, you had all the Great Lakes states and 2 Canadian provinces, Ontario and Quebec, start to collaborate on how to best manage the Great Lakes water resource. Because not just Waukesha, but other people, actually over the decades, have put proposals forth to withdraw water from the Great Lakes. Okay, so again, you have the 8 Great Lakes states, the 2 provinces that started collaborating on talks for the watershed management. That resulted in the Charter of 1985. That was the first document from those states and provinces to manage the water. It gave some guidelines for any out-of-basin use. Annex 2001 was finally implemented in 2004, but it again gave stricter guidelines for any out-of-basin use, which would have been what Waukesha was looking for. And then along kind of as the Annex 2001 evolved, it became what's now known as the Great Lakes Compact, which was signed by the states in 2005 and signed into law that would have been by Obama in December of 2008. Okay, so that became federal law, and so now the Great Lakes Compact governs the use. So although it's a law, it's really a water management document. And so what that meant is all states had to abide by that. Okay, And it was based on the things you might expect, right? Not only the science, but economic concerns. It banned diversions. So actually what Waukesha was requesting was actually banned, but as with all bans, there's exceptions. States had to come up with consistent standards to manage the water. Conservation and efficiency had to be ramped up. And as usual with all public issues, public involvement in the process. Okay. So once that was passed, each state had to come up with their own language. Okay. And so Wisconsin came up with its own compact implementation language. And one of the big things is, what's the definition of a reasonable water supply alternative? Because people said, well, Waukesha can just get away with groundwater. They don't need to have Lake Michigan water. And so without getting into too much of the legalese, you just had to show that the supply alternative didn't have greater adverse effects than the proposed or new or increased diversion. And so basically Waukesha had to say that Lake Michigan would be a reasonable, or had to prove that it was a reasonable water supply. Dovetailed on that implementation language, Wisconsin already had some existing law for a long time, but it dealt mostly with surface water. And that was the public trust doctrine, which said that lakes and rivers basically are owned by everybody, and part of that was defined as navigable waters. Okay. And so there was some existing surface water laws to help guide principles for the water management. Though this has been around for decades. In more recent years, they actually recognized that groundwater needed protecting as well. So there's Wisconsin Act 410, or Chapter 160, came around in the early mid 80s that dealt with starting to protect aquifers. And then Act 310 came around early 2000s, again, around that same time that the compact was being negotiated, which said that areas could be put in groundwater management areas. So that's, Waukesha is currently in a groundwater management zone because our water table levels have dropped more than 50 feet from pre-development levels. So again, I'm just trying to give a picture for what sort of Waukesha was kind of going through. Dovetailed on that is basically a Great Lakes regional conversation about how to manage water. And then in terms of just Wisconsin, there's also the start of a regional water supply plan. Okay, because not only Waukesha, but other communities were dealing with water issues. And so it was thought it's best to be developed as a region, right? This access to water doesn't follow political boundaries. And so from about 2002, 2010, a regional water supply plan was developed. So a whole bunch of science, a whole bunch of studies were commissioned, kind of organized through Sewer PAC, Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission. And again, the goals were conservation, good land use planning, public safety, economic and efficient systems, and then plans that are adaptive. And so basically it brought together communities, regional experts to develop a plan. And without getting too much into that,
one quick interruption here, Joe. Does this plan protect sensitive recharge areas? Is that in there at all?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So recharge is part of it, and in what I'll show later on is they did identify. I don't know what's beeping in here. Apologize that. Apparently something in the battery's going bad and something in my office. I haven't been here in a couple of weeks at least. That should go away. Yeah, so definitely recharge zones, enhanced recharge areas are part of the plan and were looked at. So yeah, the inventory, what communities use, how they treated that water and returned it back into the systems. And so good question there. And actually I'll highlight some of those here. So in the final recommendation, they did recommend that the city of Waukesha would be converted from groundwater to surface water, and with a return flow component. So that was important. Initially when Waukesha said, hey, we'd love to get Lake Michigan water, but boy, we want to treat it and return it down the Fox River like we currently do. Because right now Waukesha basically mines groundwater We use it, we treat it, and we discharge it into the Fox River, which ultimately ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. And so, it's just basically, it's a one-use system. And so the compact, though, prescribed that you had to return the water to Lake Michigan. And so, as you can see on this figure here to the right, these areas in kind of dark blue are existing users of Lake Michigan water. The areas in this green were communities that said, hey, it's going to be best for you to move from groundwater to surface water. And you can see Waukesha is one of those communities. Now, again, we're totally outside that subcontinental divide. These other communities in green are either totally within the Lake Michigan watershed or they border that divide, okay? Which if you border the divide, you only have to apply to the state. If you're outside of the divide like Waukesha, you had to get approval, unanimous approval of all Great Lakes governors, which was getting unanimous vote on anything is a pretty tall order. So they talked about which communities should stay on groundwater, which should use go to Lake Michigan water, which should move maybe from deep aquifer water to surface aquifer water, that whole balance, right? They talked about enhanced rainfall infiltration areas to enhance recharge, and also there's communities that would just stay on private wells. All right. So again, with that backdrop, then, right, you had just Waukesha recognizing the issue, dealing with the Department of Justice. You had the whole negotiation of the Great Lakes Compact. You had the Sewer Pack Regional Supply Plan going on. Waukesha has invested, literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in sort of the science of it. So they said, well, we're ready. We're going to go for the application. We think that Lake Michigan is our best option. Okay. So again, if you look here, this top picture here is the Great Lakes Watershed. Again, if you're outside that divide, no diversions are allowed. Waukesha, although we're only 1.5 miles from the topographic divide, the city boundaries itself actually aren't within it, but we are in what's called a straddling county. So the county itself straddles the divide. And so because of that, we could actually apply for diversion. Okay. And so that's what gave us the right. If we weren't in a straddling county, we couldn't even apply. Okay. So again, here's another visual here. Here you have a subcontinental divide. That's that topographic divide. Here's that groundwater divide we talked about, which put the ground watershed within the Lake Michigan watershed. And then here's the city again. So again, we're in a straddling county. The gray area is the city. This blue area, the extended blue areas are wastewater. The city of Waukesha by now has to provide wastewater services to those parts of the townships that have basically declared that their septics don't work, and the city has to provide access to the sewer, to the clean water plant, to the wastewater treatment plant. All right. And again, just a reminder, if the county boundary for Waukesha were just a little bit further to the west, we couldn't even apply, because I know we would totally be outside of that divide. So
I've got another quick question. Do you want it now, or do you want me to save it to the end?
Doesn't matter.
Okay, so someone was asking if we could show and argue about the radium and the confining layer. What was the pushback for getting approval for Waukesha? And someone said maybe it was the cost of the infrastructure of the 100% water return.
Yeah, and we'll all get there, right? Most of the initial pushback was for environmental concerns. So most of the pushback was from environmental organizations, including like WEAL, Waukesha Environmental Action League, and other constituents that really thought that, actually these figures respond to that, is, Waukesha was the first to ask for an exception to the diversion, and boy, you really have to be careful with precedent when it comes along. And so part of what Waukesha was trying to demonstrate, or even really the people who negotiated the Great Lakes Compact, was that if you look at the United States, only 0.9% of the population would even be eligible to request that water. So these counties here in yellow are straddling counties, okay, and again, those belong in those 8 Great Lakes states. So nobody else, unless you're in one of those yellow counties, you could not even ask for a diversion, okay. And so again, the vast majority, so it's not like people in Texas there's even been proposals to enhance the flow of water outside of Lake Michigan through Chicago to basically flood the Illinois River more to provide enhanced flow to the Mississippi River so that you could enhance transportation with the barges. That can't happen. Okay. So again, this was just to show that, only those counties, and then even of those counties, there's, in terms of the need, there's only a handful of municipalities, I think, that might actually even ask. And since Waukesha, again, we began our application in 2010, it was approved in 2016, and there has not been another application in the subsequent 4 years. So it's not like, but again, part of the concern though, legitimate concern was that, hey, all of a sudden are we going to get this laundry list of communities that now want to basically suck water out of the Great Lakes? Okay. So good, really good question. Okay. So what did Waukesha do though? So again, to prove that we needed a new water source, we went through an exhaustive effort to consider all the possible sources. So again, continues the deep aquifer, the confined aquifer, go to the unconfined aquifer, shallow aquifers, you name it, it was proposed. That used quarry water, Pewaukee Lake, Milwaukee River, Rock River, you name it. Of the reasonable ones from that whole sort of laundry list, it seemed that there came about 6 alternatives that looked reasonable. But again, expensive, but at least still reasonably feasible. Okay, and so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I just thought I'd show a little bit of it. The first alternative again was to continues the deep aquifer, but augment it with more shallow aquifer wells. But that would have meant putting wells in the Vernon Marsh area, and so there's a really significant impact on streams and wetlands then. Okay, so that turned out not to be a great option. The option that, now the punchline is out, was Lake Michigan with return flow. And at the time it was proposed, because you had to choose a supplier, the city of Oak Creek was who we had negotiated with. They would supply the water, and then we would return it to Lake Michigan via the river. All right. And again, our current supplier here is going to be Milwaukee, as it turned out, once further negotiations and time went by. So now instead of saved us a lot of pipeline route, so that now the water is basically going to start here at about 76 in Oklahoma, and it's a much straighter shot to get out to Waukesha. But Lake Michigan with return flow seemed to have a lot of positives, and we'll highlight those later. The big negative was potentially cost, and you had to return the water. Alternative 3 was, let's totally abandon the deep wells, let's do shallow aquifers, and we'll do what's called riverbank inducement, or go after the Fox River alluvium. And there it was, let's put a whole bunch of wells along the Fox River and see if we can induce water to move out of the river and into the groundwater, and then pump it out of the groundwater, where the river bank in theory would provide some filtration needs. But this would also require a new water treatment plant. Currently, we don't have a water treatment plant in Waukesha. We just pump it up from the ground. We do some treatment for radium, but essentially add some residual disinfectant, and it's off to your homes. This would actually have to be a full-scale water treatment plant. There was one that said, let's use Lake Michigan water, but then also shallow aquifers. Long story short with that is anytime you go to use the shallow aquifers, you have wetland impacts and stream impacts. And this also violates compact. Compact says if you need the water bad enough, we're your sole source, because they don't want to be mixing water from different watersheds. Alternative 5 said, hey, let's go out to Oconomowoc. Here's where the recharge zone is. Let's pop some wells out there. That turned to have some negative impacts with both surface water and groundwater out in Oconomowoc. They clearly weren't real thrilled with Waukesha proposing that. But again, we would still need about a 15-mile pipeline to get water back to Waukesha too. So again, all sorts of options. And the last option was sort of a potpourri. Hey, let's do a little bit of everything. And so as you might guess, this really isn't feasible at all. It's really expensive. Plus you're mixing multiple water sources, which in terms of the water chemistry is really unpredictable. And so, but again, those alternatives were recommended for really deep exploration. and so they were. So when we look at our consumer reports guide here, it basically showed that when we looked at environmental impacts, long-term sustainability, public health, and the ability to implement, Lake Michigan was really by far the clear, with return flow, was the clearest, best option, even though it was expensive. Here the estimate back then was about $207 million. We're currently looking at about 280 is the current estimates. But again, there were more expensive options. But in terms of long-term maintenance, the Lake Michigan is a cheaper long-term maintenance in terms of infrastructure. So again, with this study and in this application, actually here's another summary too, is that again, this Lake Michigan alternative, you weren't disturbing, almost no disturbance to wetlands. We could return all the water to Lake Michigan. Actually, because we're not using any groundwater, we're going to get some groundwater recovery in the wells, deep wells and shallow wells. No wells would be impacted. It met all the requirements. And there'd be actually enhanced base flow contribution to the rivers, to the streams, because we're not drawing any surface or deep aquifer water. And again, essentially almost no wetlands impacted, whereas again, anytime you use groundwater, especially the shallow aquifer water, there's a significant impact on wetlands. So this was a justification then for Lake Michigan. One of the other big question marks then was the amount of water Waukesha was going to ask for. Currently, we're averaging around 7 million gallons a day. And so we had to project out to about 2030 and then out to 2050. And then you have your average daily demand and max daily demand that would include needs for fire protection. And so there's a big debate about, how much water are you asking for? Because is Waukesha, are they just planning for growth, which all communities by law have to plan for growth, controlled growth, or is it sprawl? What's Waukesha after? So there was some really close scrutiny of the volume of water that Waukesha was asking for.
Joe, I think this is a good time for this question. Someone asked, are there any efforts kind of connected to this being made by Waukesha to reduce the amount of water it's using on average, or not at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so, in part, in terms of preparation for this, and some people say that, Waukesha did it just to increase the viability of their ask. But yeah, Waukesha has some really aggressive conservation. We have the only reverse conservation rates in the state, where basically the more you use, the more you get charged, or they call it inclining rate structure. We give people money to replace toilets, shower heads, rain barrels. We work with industries to provide monies for them to sort of retrofit processes where there's major savings. I actually, just to try to save some slides, I actually pulled out the conservation slide. I have it later on. I have it tucked away in my additional resources. I could pull that up later if we have time. But yeah, Waukesha is aggressively working on conservation measures for sure. And again, that's kind of the water utilities walk that fine line, because you want to stay viable by selling water, right? You want that revenue, but at the same time, you want to push conservation, but that means you sell less water. But again, because we tend to, there is some small growth, you can minimize the additional need for water through conservation. Same way electric utilities deal with that, right? Even though many things become more efficient in terms of electrical appliances and that, because more people are using them, we still use about the same amount of electricity. So yeah, good question. So again, so off to the Great Lakes Council, right? Lots of study. So now we go to the Great Lakes Council and say, yep, we want Lake Michigan water. We think we have a good story. And again, to cut to the chase, it was approved in June of 2016. So again, the initial application was in 2010. So it actually took 6 total years of back and forth with the regional body. Because also remember that this compact council had never been tested. So it was basically pretty raw law. And so all these policies, procedures, guidelines had to be developed along the way, because Waukesha was the first test of the Great Lakes Compact, and people wanted to make sure that it worked. But again, part of the major issues, we were part of the regional aquifer system. We didn't have a reasonable alternative supply. The deep aquifer wasn't sustainable, they found. The picture over here is, again, just all the, this is Dan Dukniak. He's the water utility manager. There are aldermen here. Here's the former governor of the state. So everybody came out for it. The Mayor Riley, and you might even recognize a really handsome person right here. I even got to go to the big announcement. So there were some other considerations too that we're bound to return the flow. Again, this business of being hydrologically connected to the basin. Again, so the Compact Council also provided evidence for why they made the decision they did. And again, that was all 8 Great Lakes governors approved it, which was, they thought, and also Ontario and Quebec had, they couldn't vote per se, but they did provide their recommendations. The only major change to it was, again, this debate about the water service area. So initially, the state of Wisconsin, the DNR said, well, make your water service area coincident with the wastewater area. And that's this area outlined in black. So again, we serve a lot of those townships. There's major debate about it, and ultimately the Compact Council came back and said, nope, you can only provide water within city limits. You can't provide, you can't provide water to the townships. The only exception was these town islands. And so Waukesha's water ask was reduced from about 10.1 to 8.2 million gallons a day. So that was a major contention there. And so, for example, if the wells go bad in these townships, they're on their own. In the future, they have to go through their own application process if they have some significant need or well failures. Again, just a summary slide again. 6 years just for the approval to make its way through. And so where does that put us then? So once the approval, it was like big size relief. If you're from the city of Waukesha, there's still a lot of eyes on Waukesha, that's for sure. But now it turned into hey, we had a plan for basically a big construction project, big public works project. And so there was lots of permitting to be done, public outreach, lots of talk. How do you finance a $280 million project? Because most of the financing mechanisms are based on like 20-year kind of instruments. And so we've been working with the Public Service Commission and the EPA and other organizations to basically, how can you extend that financing so that basically all users of this system will pay over time? Because the system should last roughly 100 years. And so right now the project we paid off over about a 40-year window. That is as far as we were allowed to stretch out the financing for the project. There's lots of, we had to study the route, right? Because now we're working with several communities. They play a role in the ability to go through their communities and get permits. You've all heard of Flint, Michigan. The water supply transition is going to be critical, right? Because we're moving from a groundwater source to a surface water source. Those have different chemistries. So I'll talk a little bit more about that just because I'm a chemist. So again, this distribution is going to require some not only hydrologic modeling, but chemical modeling in terms of water quality, disinfection, and corrosion control. And so currently, Milwaukee is going to supply the water. This is pretty much the route. Go along Oklahoma Avenue, Coffee Road. We actually had to move our booster pumping station from, it was proposed Manuka, that will now be along Cleveland Avenue. The return flow pipeline, again, it's going to go from our clean water plant. So it's not called the wastewater treatment plant anymore. It's called the clean water plant. And the return flow pipeline, again, it'll go down like Racine Avenue, make some twists and bends, and ultimately we'll discharge it into the river in Oak Creek. So again, we have to work with several communities, both for the supply pipeline as well as the return flow pipeline. Okay, so again, this is the supply, this is the return flow. Okay, so in terms of the water supply considerations, again, corrosion control, and just in a kind of a nutshell, right now we add sodium silicate to the water to help coat the pipes to prevent corrosion, because most of these are ductile iron pipes. Milwaukee uses orthophosphate or phosphate. What's an interesting story with that is that it's effective corrosion control, but you also have to watch the levels of phosphate you discharge into natural waters because you have to worry about eutrophication. And so, but in terms of disinfection, currently we use sodium hypochlorite or bleach. And and Waukesha, Milwaukee uses ozone, and then the residual disinfectant is chloramine. And so that will be, we've done some study, and not we, I should use the word generously there, but the city is contracted with to have that work done to make sure that now that we're having these chloramines in our system, it doesn't negatively impact the chemistry in our distribution system. And then also there's differences in pH, alkalinity, sulfate, chloride, hardness, and total dissolved solids. Nice thing is most people, we should be able to move off of our water softeners because the Lake Michigan water is not hard. But again, we will have to watch especially alkalinity, sulfate, and chloride because those are the major contributors to corrosion. And so we did a water supply transition plan. This we did help with, got some Carroll students involved, and the city and their consulting companies. We got some copper pipes out of homes and businesses in the city. We pumped water through and then put through the different types of chemistry based on either the orthophosphate or the chloramines to see that if we started to pump different water through those pipes, were we going to mobilize either the scale that had accumulated in the pipes or mobilize lead in those lead solder fittings, which can still be in some of the homes. So again, in terms of water supply transition, where the city is definitely on top of that. So we've done this pipe loop testing, lots of modeling of the distribution system. That'll be heavy sampling will occur. They're going to do some what's called unidirectional flushing before the turnover, and they're actually starting that now to really try to flush those water pipes clean of any kind of scale before the transition occurs in late 2022 or early 2023. In terms of return flow considerations, the big positive is Waukesha can return 100%. All right, every drop that we take from Lake Michigan, we can return. So we'll meet all the requirements. There'll be no impacts to Great Lakes water levels. One of the big benefits is, in terms of the river, is that they apparently since the 70s, they've been looking for ways to increase the flow, especially to the lower river where it discharges in Racine, to enhance the salmon fishery there. There's apparently a hatchery just upstream there of Racine, and the enhanced flow from Waukesha now discharging our water into the root will be to enhance that salmon hatchery. Long term, right now the city's paying the USGS and UW Parkside to monitor the Root River to get some baseline water quality for the RITs, so we know what's going on with it both before and after the city would start to discharge our treated wastewater into it. And I started a project with students. We've done it now for 3 summers. We're actually looking at the Fox River. There's some questions, maybe common concerns that now that we're not going to discharge treated wastewater into the Fox, there'll be roughly 6 million gallons a day less going into the Fox. How is that going to impact the water quality in the Fox River? And so we've been looking at similar components as the Root River. So in Root River, they've been monitoring BOD, total suspended solids, dissolved oxygen, phosphorus, fecal coliform, etc. And again, the Waukesha's return flow quality is going to be better than current Root River characteristics, and will certainly meet all the discharge required by the EPA as enforced by the Wisconsin DNR. Again, there'll be some upgrades to Waukesha's wastewater treatment plant, to the clean water plant, I guess as we should call it now. So again, Waukesha's got a really high quality plant as it is. We have the tertiary treatment as well. So you have the typical primary, secondary treatment. The tertiary treatment, which occurs sort of down here in this area, is again after the secondary treatment in these aeration tanks, which removes most of the biological oxygen demand. We remove phosphate in this tertiary treatment, and then provide final disinfection aeration. Again, currently we pump this water that's treated into the Fox River, which is really commonplace. most municipalities just charge into rivers nationwide, so that's not particularly unusual. But what the plant will do now is we're basically going to build a pump station here. They've already dug the hole for it. This picture to the left here is actually them getting ready to install the first pipe where this little yellow arrow is here. So you're going to have a pump station here where now any of the treated water hits this pump station, and now it begins its path back to the Root River. Again, the upgrade of phosphorus is the new requirements is going to be that we have to be below 75 part per billion for phosphorus. Whereas I think the current level is 175, 150, something like that. So they keep, they meaning like the EPA, DNR, keep dropping that phosphorus level because it contributes to eutrophication. So we're going to have to enhance the efficiency of our tertiary treatment. And again, I noted that we're also doing some Fox River sampling here. I think Kelly is actually on this call. This was my first student that was on this project, Kelly Burmeister. You out there, Kelly? Maybe she already logged off. She's a really bashful person.
She did say hello in the chat.
I'm here. I'm here.
She's out there. So one of the nice things is when you go out and do field sampling, you can get some ice cream periodically. And so it's just a picture of what we were doing. So when we were going, we had 10 sites. We had one upstream of the clean water plant, one at the clean water plant. This is this picture here. This is the outfall of the clean water plant. And then we did 8 sites downstream that stretched all the way down to south of Lake Tishigan in Waterford. But when we went to sample, we looked for dissolved oxygen, temperature, pH, alkalinity, by both flame and now we have ICP-MS on campus, where we can look for, again, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sodium. We look for some trace metals. Actually, what I should add here is copper as well. Cadmium, copper, lead, chromium, nickel, zinc, and then ion chromatography. Actually, I thought I'd plug this. One of our chemistry alums donated an IC a couple of years ago, and we've been using that significantly. So thank John Shabushnik out there. I don't know if he's on this call or not. But the ion chromatography allows us to look for chloride, nitrate, phosphate, sulfate, some other ones, but these are the more significant ones here, the ones that we actually see at detectable levels. And so I'm trying to keep Carol invested in this project. We couldn't do the Root River work because right now I'm on the president of the Waukesha Water Commission, which is basically just a volunteer thing, but it's a citizen group that oversees the water utility. And so it was apparently a conflict of interest to have Carol be doing the monitoring on the Root River. So that's why UW Parkside is doing it. I mean, they're doing a good job. I'm not saying that, but it would have been great for Carol to be invested in that too. But yeah, and so that's and where we're at right now then is construction has actually begun. And so there's a groundbreaking in Milwaukee just in early December. It was a cold day. You might again recognize a really handsome guy right here. But again, you had both folks in Milwaukee and Waukesha kind of kick off the groundbreaking of the return, of all the permits and approvals to get things rolling for the water supply pipeline. And this is the picture of the first piece of ductile iron pipe. This is, I think this is 36-inch pipe, ductile iron. It's about 22 feet long. Each of those has to be bolted together with about 36 of these major bolts. Then they put on these anode bags to prevent corrosion. And we only have to install about 10,700 more of those, and we'll be all done with the project. This was my first and my probably only ever golden shovel I'll get. So it's kind of a proud moment. It was a long path. Again, I'm kind of riding just happy to be part of this story. But the bulk of the work was done by a lot of other people. Dan Dukniak deserves a lot of the credit, the Waukesha general manager for the water utility. So I think that that sort of completes the story where we're at with the Waukesha water story.